Did you know the library is full of dirt? And get the dirt we will today. Today is Friday, and this is the day we will unveil another surprise theme. Today's Get the Dirt is on knitting, crocheting, and sewing. Let's get the dirt on a real yarn tale and some great ideas you can do with yarn. Here are a few books for beginning knitters. Books like these can be found in the 746 section of the library. 12 easy knitting projects. Knitting. Cool knitting for kids. And Susan B. Anderson's Kids Knitting Workshop. Knitting can be dated back to the time of the Egyptians. And the word knit has its roots in the word knot. Here are some knitting tools. These are needles. Needles are used to knit things like hats and socks. Here's a pair of socks that was knitted. Here's a simple method of knitting that is helpful for those who like to fidget or who spend time traveling in the car. It's called finger knitting. So what you do is you have a ball of yarn, and I'm going to put a loop on the end. How you do that is I have, it's called a slip knot. So I have the piece of yarn, I make it go like this, twist it, grab the long piece of yarn, and I pull so it looks like this. And it can become, if you want to slip, you just have to pull on the ends and it disappears. So again, we have a piece of yarn, around and through. Very big slip knot. There. You can also make the slip knot smaller by pulling gently on the long piece. So how to finger knit? So you loop the knot over your thumb and you just weave it in and out your fingers like this. Then you weave it in and out your fingers again. Now, one more time. So on a couple of fingers you will see two pieces of yarn. So what you do, it's kind of to see that's the side that I'm looking at. So you take the bottom piece of the yarn and you go over the top piece. So you do that to that one and to this one. Now you do it again. The bottom piece of yarn over the top. And you just continually do that. Bottom piece of yarn over the top. And you can make tons of things from finger knitting. You can make scarves. You can make headbands, blankets, rugs. You can make a ton of things. You could probably even make a sweater, even though I've never done it. Finger knitting is a great way to just keep your fingers busy, and you can make awesome Christmas presents or birthday presents or just presents in general with finger knitting. It makes a cool sort of chain stitch. Can't see very well on this one, but I have this rung of finger knitting, and you see I have where my thumb was. And if you look closely, it sort of looks like there's this big line and then there's little loops coming off of it. And you basically can finger knit for a long time. You can make super cool stuff, and how to tie off finger knitting. So say it's as long as you want it to be. What you do is, first of all, you take off the thumb. No, you don't take off the thumb. You take off the pinky finger and this finger and your ring finger. Take off those and you tie them together in a granny knot. Just take the loops and you just go like you would tie them in a granny knot. Be tricky if the loops aren't big enough. If you need the loops to be bigger, you can just pull. Alright, so now you've got the granny knot. And you take your middle finger and your pointer finger, and you tie those in a granny knot. Then you cut the string. And it looks sort of funky because it isn't very long, but it's going to look something like that. And if you want a headband, you tie these ends to this, and it would make a headband. Not going to fit on my head, but if it was bigger, it would. You can also make doll headbands with these. You can do a ton of stuff with finger knitting. Even a bracelet. The book Knit Your Bit is based on a real knit-in at Central Park, New York in 1918. These are some pictures of a knit-in. It's where people do races of knitting. Some socks, blankets. There's some sheep. These are boys that are knitting. There were girls knitting on this side. Knit your bit. When Pop left to be a soldier, I wanted to go with him. I'm brave, I told Pop. I know, Mickey, he said, patting my shoulder. And you'll need to be, 'cause it takes just as much courage to stay behind. Back home, Mama pulled out her knitting needles. Our soldiers will be cold come winter. Teach me, Ellie begged. I want to help. What about you, Mickey? Mama asked, fishing out more needles. No way. Boys don't knit. Besides, I want to go do something big to help. Ellie finished her first hat a few days later. It wasn't much to look at, but she wrapped it up to send to Pop right away. You could knit him something too, Mickey. Like I said, sis, knitting is for girls. No, it's not, Ellie cried, grabbing the newspaper. Everyone's helping. Look at these firemen. And even President Wilson keeps sheep on the White House lawn for wool. Ellie turned the page. If we each do a little, make something big, she said. I just rolled my eyes. A few days later, Miss Robin tacked a poster on the bulletin board. Wouldn't it be great if students from our class entered the knitting bee? Miss Robin asked. All the boys, including me, jeered. Mickey, you're always talking about how brave you are, Sarah said. This is your chance out to help. But I bet you're scared you can't learn. Me scared? My friends and I can beat you any day. Mickey, sit down, Nick hissed. Dare you to enter, all the girls cried together. It's a deal, boys against girls. We'll call our team the Boys Knitting Brigade. I thought that sounded big and important enough. Fine, said Josie. We'll be the Pearl Girls. Pearl Girls? I didn't even know what Pearl meant. I gulped. What had I gotten us into? Purl is a type of stitch. P-U-R-L. Mama offered to give us lessons. Nick and Dan came over every day after school to practice. After we'd figured out how to hold our needles and knit, which was hard enough, Mama showed us how to purl. Nick was the major of mufflers. I was the sergeant of socks, which are not easy, believe me, especially the heels. As for Dan, well, he mostly just got his yarn tangled. Our cat loved it. Finally, the day of the knitting bee arrived. Central Park was a sea of women and men, old and young, and lots of girls. "Forward, march," I commanded. "Mickey, we're the only boys," whispered Nick. "I sure hope we don't get laughed out of here." "Look at that food! When do we eat?" Dan asked. "Those sausages smell delicious." "Over here, boys," called Miss Robin. Naturally, the Perel girls were ready to go. Sarah smiled sweetly, but she was all business. "Get ready to be beaten by the fastest knitters in New York City." I led my troops to a nearby bench. "Ignore those girls, soldiers. Speed isn't everything. There are prizes for the best knitting, too." We unwrapped our yarn and grabbed our needles. The band struck up a rousing march. Drummers beat tin buckets, with knitting needles, of course. Rad-tat-tat, rad-tat-tat. "Cast on!" See, they're all starting to do slip knots. My men performed with courage. Mostly. Dan came close to deserting us for the food tables. And Nick got distracted while watching Miss Rizzo's flying fingers. She won a prize for knitting a sweater in 5 hours and 45 minutes exactly. We knit all afternoon, and the next day too. By the third day, the pressure was on. Dan's piece looked more like an old dish rag than a hat. Nick was still clicking away, though the edges of his muffler were all zigzaggy because he kept adding stitches or dropping them. I'd finished a sock yesterday, now I was on my second. I was feeling pretty good. The first sock was definitely my best yet. Maybe I'd even win a prize for the pair, if I could get the second one done by the end of the day. Ellie offered to bring me some lunch. I just shook my head. "Oh, you're doing so good, Mickey. Let me see." Ellie gave a gasp. "Oh no, Mickey, look," she whispered. "A hole. You dropped a stitch at the beginning right there." Somehow I'd missed it, but Ellie was right. To make it perfect, I'd have to rip the whole sock apart and start all over again. I hung my head. Knitting was stupid. I felt like breaking my nails and stomping on everything. "Nice work, kid." I glanced up. A young soldier stood before me, nodded toward my one perfect sock on the bench. "Thank you, sir," I stammered. I was still feeling miserable. "But I'm not really so good at this." "You're trying, aren't you? That's what counts." We were silent for a minute. "You got someone over there?" "Yes, sir, my dad," I told him. All at once I missed Pop so much my eyes stung. I wonder what he was. I could almost see him hiding in a muddy ditch, or shivering in the rain. How could I do anything, little or big, to really help? "Warm wool socks would have felt mighty cozy last winter," the soldier said. "So you kept knitting, kid. I bet your dad will be really glad to wear those socks." "Yes, sir." I wasn't really sure what to do next, so I stood and saluted. Then I took the sock apart and began again. Sarah had finished a muffler, Molly had made a pair of socks, and Josie's hat was perfect. "Now let's see how you did," said Sarah. For a minute we stood in silence. "I guess my yarn got a little greasy from the sausages," Dan said. We all laughed. I held up my hand to Sarah. "You beat us fair and square. No hard feelings, Mickey? No, just wait for the next time." I never did finish that pair of Central Park knitting bee socks. Instead, just before I left, I got up my courage and found the young soldier. "This is for you." I held up my best ever perfect sock. "Thanks, kid," he said, "and don't give up." "I won't," I promised. As for what happened after that, well, Nick and Dan never went near knitting needles again. But all by herself, Ellie made hats for every soldier in Pop's unit. They sent pictures of themselves. As for me, I did keep trying, though it took a while. I finally knit a pair of socks for Pop. He wrote back to say they're his favorites. He promised to wear them on the day he came home. And he did. Here are some posters that are asking people to knit things for the army. Here are a few books for beginner crocheters. Books like these can be found in the 746 section of the library as well. There is Cool Crocheting for kids. Crocheting Clothes Kids Love. And My First Crochet Book. Crochet comes from the French word for hook. See how these crocheting needles have hook at the end compared to knitting needles? There's a hook at the end. Compared to this one, that is pointed and has a stop at the end. Both crochet and knitting use needles. Start with a slip knot, and you can cast on to get started. The stitches and method of making stitches differs, and with crochet you only use one needle. Knitting requires two needles, unless you are finger knitting. Many hats and scarves use tassels and pom-poms as accoutrements to decorate. Here's a purple tassel I made. And here's a bigger tassel. And if you want to see a really big tassel, I used 2 chairs to make this tassel. And sometimes people also use pom-poms, like these. Tassels and pom-poms are fairly easy to make and can be a fun addition to any of your clothing attire. This book, My First Crochet Book, by Alison McNaughton, shows a traditional way of making pom-poms using 2 cardboard donuts. In the book, Babysitter's Guide to Keeping Kids Entertained, by Abby Clutch, I found a simpler way by using a fork. But I prefer to use fingers. And if you're going to use fingers, you need to be very careful and wrap it around your fingers very, very loosely. Otherwise, you can hurt yourself. This is the one section with the paper, with the pom-poms. Now I'll show you how I make pom-poms and tassels. Now to make a pom-pom, you're going to have to start with a ball of yarn. And you take 2 fingers. You wrap it around one finger, and it can be tricky to keep it to stay on that finger. I usually have it go through once, like that. And then you spread your fingers out, depending on how big you want your pom-pom to be, and you just start wrapping it around your fingers. The more your fingers are spread out, the more you're going to want to wrap it around. You see, otherwise your pom-pom will look more like a very droopy pom-pom. So it will actually look more like a tassel than a pom-pom. As you wrap, you'll notice your fingers get closer together. You need to be careful though, because if you wrap your fingers too tightly, they'll turn purple, and that's not good. So after you've wrapped about this much, depending on your thickness of yarn, you're going to want to cut it. And then you grab a long piece of yarn and you feed it through the bottom of your fingers so it goes underneath all of the loops that you just made going around your 2 fingers. So one end sticking on the other end like this. Now, you might want some help for the next part. What you do is you have someone take the 2 strings and tie a very, very firm granny knot that pinches all the layers of yarn together. You have to do it very, very tightly. So you're going to want to make sure it's very tight before you finalize your granny knot. After that, you can pull it off, and you take a pair of scissors, and you feed it through where one of your fingers was, and cutting all the loops in half. But before that, or after, I usually do it before, you're going to want to take, if it's not tight enough, you're going to want to retie a granny knot. So you tie it on another side and you pull very, very, very tightly. And then you just tie a granny knot. Like that. Now, you want to make sure all the loops are cut. So you just have very, very short pieces of yarn sticking all over the place. Sometimes if they're all in a line, you can cut multiple at once. Then you're going to want to fluff it up and make sure that you have all the loops cut. If you want to, you can even trim some sides and make it more round. Then you have a pom-pom. Now, to make a tassel, you could use a piece of cardboard. Let me see if I have one. Or you can use a lot of things. You pretty much just need something. There's several ways you can do it. You can either use your fingers, you can use a piece of cardboard, you can use a book. If you want to make a giant one, you can use 2 chairs. I'm going to demo it with a piece of cardboard. So what you do is, again, you take your yarn, you take the piece of cardboard, and if it's a rectangle, you want to go you want to do the long part. So you pinch it up at the top, and like when you're making a pom-pom, you pretty much just wrap it around and make it so it is. The yarn ball is going to want to roll away, trust me. Cats will love this. So if you have a cat and you're making a tassel, beware, because your cat might want to sample the ball of yarn that you're making your tassel with. So once you've wrapped it around enough, it's completely up to you how many times you want to wrap it around. Trying to find my ball of yarn. You want to cut it. And then, just like with the pom-pom, you grab another piece of yarn. Except this time, you feed it through the middle of the cardboard right here. And then you tie a granny knot. Make sure to tie it at the very, very center of the cardboard. Tie it super, super tight. And then you flip it over and you look directly across from where those are hanging. You go to the top and you cut. Now your tassel will look like this. For the last part in making your tassel, actually the second last, you're going to want one more piece of yarn. Now you can have a person hold the top, because you're going to have to pull on it. This could also work really well for doll hair. You could sew it on top of a doll and make braids if you want. But for making a tassel, take your other piece of yarn and you wrap it around near the top. Then, you again tie a super tight granny knot, making it so that there's a little ball on top of your tassel. Then, some people would like to trim the bottom of your tassel to make sure all the ones are even. And if you want to hang it up, take the top and you do a knot. There's lots of knots that you can do. I'm trying to remember the knot that I used here. Ah, yes. So you remember how I made the slip knot? So you do that, except instead of grabbing this piece, you grab the piece that was cut, the tail, and you bring it up. So it's going to look like this, and you just pull on that. Then you get a little knot, and you can trim off the stuff on top. Now, you have a tassel. If you want to make a doll, you'd pretty much make a tassel, and then you would take sections right here, and could tie them off, and then you would have a doll. It's a great thing to do if you are babysitting and you need something to do with your babysitting people. This book, Knit, Hook, and Spin by Lori Carlson, has some great craft projects and ideas. It can be found in the 745 section of the library. Did you notice that in all these yarn books found in the 740 section of the library? The 740s are all about perfecting your art, be it the graphic or drawing or textile sort. Sewing is another useful, practical, and fun hobby. Evidence of sewing can be found in all cultures, even though history from ancient times until now. If you needed clothes, or if you needed to mend your clothes, you sewed. And the clothing materials and threads differed as people used the resources available to them. Bone, wood, thorns, and metal for needles, hides, fiber, cloth, garments, leather, twine, silk, and cotton for thread. The book, Queen of Inventions by Lori Carlson, gives us a brief history of sewing. This book is non-fiction and is found in the 681 section of the library. So, if you want to read this book, make sure you check it out from your library. It's a very interesting book and will help you if you wish to sew. Here are some of the many tools of the trade. You would have a pair of scissors to cut your thread. You don't want to drop your scissors because they're very sharp. Many times, people have scissors that they only use for sewing, because then they stay sharp and you can cut cloth easy with them. Many people use sewing machines to sew. If you're going to get a sewing machine and you want to sew a lot, I suggest saving your money and investing in a good machine. Talk to other seamstresses on what they found good or not so great machines. I've used an economical model, and they work, but you will have to be patient, as a low-end model can be frustrating because it is lacking in precision. If you're going to hand sew, you're going to probably have book of needles. Now, it's not an actual book, but it sort of opens like a book, and it's full of needles. And you're probably also going to have a needle threader. It helps you thread the needles. It has a very fine metal tip made out of wire. And you would put it through the eye of the needle to help you thread. In this particular needle book, the threader goes in the front of it. You would have pencils or markers for marking down your pattern. You would have pins. There are lots and lots of types of pins. These pins look like tiny little nails. Some people will get pins that have a teardrop shape of color on the back. You're going to have a thimble. A thimble helps you push your needle without getting hurt if you're going through thick cloth, or it's so you don't prick yourself with the needle when you're sewing. If you remember from the ballet dreams episode, when people go on point, they have to sew their point shoes. They have to sew the ribbons and elastics on. Then you really want to have a thimble because it's very, very hard to push the needle through the cloth, and the thimble helps. You are also probably going to want a seam ripper. If I can get it out of the case. It has a case on top because it's very, very sharp. It looks sort of like that. And what you do is you go through the seam like this, and it's very sharp in that section. So say, I'm not actually going to do it, but you see that? You would go under that and then just pull up. You see these knits that I sewed? They're seams. So you would go under the seam and then just pull up, and it would rip the seam. It's helpful if you make mistakes a lot. Then you would also have a tape measure if you are making big or even little sewing projects. It's very important so you have the correct measurements. When you're sewing, you also would want to, when you cut the fabric, you're going to want to put an inch on either side to save room for an inch to a half an inch to save room for the sewing. Otherwise, the doll dress is going to be, or whatever you're making, is going to be way too small for the measurements. One time, I tried making a doll dress. Me and my sister tried making a doll dress, and we used the exact measurements of the doll. The dress was like way too small. So, you need to make sure you measure everything, because depending on what you're making. If you're sewing, you're going to want to have a pin cushion and a needle sharpener. Now, these come together. It's a super cute set, but you don't always need a needle sharpener, but a pin cushion is what you put needles and pins in so you don't lose them. And, of course, you're going to need lots and lots of thread. Besides sewing notions, if you want to move from sewing by hand to sewing by machine, I suggest saving your money, like I said earlier. Sewing is practical because you can use it to make clothes and keep the clothes you own in good condition. Sewing is also practical because you can use your skills to mend clothes for others and create projects to sell. Sewing is fun because from it you can find a creative outlet and new friends. Sewing is also a way to remember quilts were and still are a way to pass down your family history. Quilts were first made through scraps from making family garments. Today, many people make quilts to display or ribbons they've won or t-shirt or the words of a t-shirt from places they've been. A great book to show the importance and history of quotes is found in the, you guessed it, the 640 section. 746 section of the library, and is called The Quilting Bee by Gail Gibbons. We were made for fellowship, to be connected. In the past, neighbors would have various types of bees to work together on a project and connect. The quilt women made out a quilting bee, representing the connectedness they shared while quilting. While the book, A Book for Black-Eyed Susan, is a very interesting book. It is a book, it's by Judy Young. It's a fictional book. It was inspired by the tales the author read about travel on the Oregon and California trails. It's about a sister who makes a quilted book for her baby sister. So, if you are interested, I suggest reading this book. It's a very, very cool book about how you can even make books with sewing. Cloth books are a great item for babies. Maybe you have a new baby in your family. A simple book like Cora, the girl in the book, made for her sister would be a great book to remember for the new baby in your life. A way to share memories that she is too young to remember. You could make quilt patches of little things that you did with your baby sister or brother. Cloth books are also a great item to make for someone you know who is suffering from memory loss, dementia, or Alzheimer's. A simple book sewn with items to feel and see, things that they might recognize from their past and can bring that person comfort and help them feel connected. There are so many great books written with sewing ideas that are simple and fun. Here are a few I suggest. There is 5-inch fabric squares. It has some great ideas for what you can do with 5 inches of fabric. 5 by 5 inches. Technically that'd be 25 square inches. That's math. Super simple sewing for kids. Simple sewing. Try this sewing. I love crafts sewing. Sewing is a very common title for sewing books. Fleece Hat Friends. 25 easy to sew projects. I found this book very interesting because they take animals and they make them into hats. Not actual animals. They make hats to look like animals. Sewing for children. And what shall we do today? Thanks for joining us for today's Get the Dirt. There are innumerable interesting reading trails for you to discover, and it all starts with a free library card, your pass to a portal full of amazing adventure and excitement, your pass to $1 million education. Thanks for joining us today for Get the Dirt, and thanks for all the ladies in my life who have taken an interest in me for teaching me the basics of knitting, crocheting, sewing, and crafting. Life situations have taken us different directions, and some of you may have gone on to be with Jesus. But the encouragement you gave me and the patience you showed me to helping me learn has given me the confidence to be where I am today. I'll see you next time.